So I'll get started so that we can end on time. And I'm so glad to see so many people join us today. Like I said before, my name is Dr. Audra Smalls-Monte. I'm one of the chairs of the Minority Affairs Committee, along with Dr. Joseph and Dr. Ramsabik. And we to have you here today. This is our 5th talk in the series, Dismantling Racism, Building Anti-Racist Psychiatrists, where we're helping to bring awareness, education, reflection, and empathy to build a community of anti-racist psychiatrists. In accordance with Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and in response to the increasing bias attacks against members of the Asian American community, we organized this to facilitate a discussion on what defines a person as Asian American, Pacific Islander, experiences, stereotypes, the rise in hate crimes, and tips for dealing with trauma. So we intend for this to be a safe space to collectively share our complex thoughts and emotions surrounding these topics. And with that, I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Lee. Dr. Teresa Lee is an attending at the World Trade Center program's mental health clinic at Mount Sinai Hospital, where she works with first responders of 9/11. She is also on the board of the Eastern Group Psychotherapy Society and a member of the American Group Psychotherapy Association. At the local and national level, she lectures on and facilitates experimental workshops concerning Asian Americans in group psychotherapy. In addition to the standard one-on-one view on treatment, she also approaches her clinical and private practice work with an extensive background in facilitating groups for patients and mental health clinicians alike. As the COVID pandemic spurred the rise in anti-Asian sentiment, Dr. Lee has helped create a new wave of group spaces for Asian-identified therapists. Her invitation to contain the containers who serve the deeply affected Asian community spans coast to coast. Dr. Lee will what it means to be Asian American from a linguistic and historical perspective, the current psychiatric landscape of this growing subgroup, and highlight stereotypes and racial issues that psychiatrists should consider when treating members of the Asian identified community. And with that, we'll have Dr. Lee.
Thank you, Dr. Smalls-Monte, and good evening, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, there we go. Make y'all small. Okay. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone today, and that was a very generous introduction, so thank you. And it is so timely that we can speak tonight because of what has been happening in our country and in the last year, and with the rise in the visibility of anti-Asian sentiment. May is also Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So it's, for me, not just a cause for celebration, but a cause for reflection and reckoning with what we have yet to learn. So today, I hope I can impart some nuggets of facts from me, and later I hope to get some from you as well. To give you an idea of our journey together over the next 35 minutes, we will start with the name Asian American, and then we'll move into the history, and then we'll look at the landscape with some statistics and discuss the psychological, social, and political barriers to mental health for Asian Americans. And we'll take this a bit further and examine some subtle issues that plague Asian Americans today. And then finally, we'll close with some takeaways for you as a clinician and as a human being to consider. Given that I've mentioned Asian Americans several times, I'm curious what image, what thought or association popped into your head. When I first started running groups for Asian American therapists, I caught myself feeling surprised when an Indian American therapist asked to join one of my groups. It's embarrassing for me to say now, but I can honestly look back and say that it took me a moment to realize that my knee-jerk association with Asian American was, at that time, the Far East Asian. And I imagine I'm not the only one. So like me, did you think of these people with these features when Asian American? This is called the phenotype, the outward expression of our genes. And for many, Asian American conjures up the East Asian profile of the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Koreans. However, for some of you, the world map may have popped up instead. We can see on the map that our East Asian countries take up less than half of what's colorfully depicted here. What's perhaps less automatic in our associations is that Asia includes the regions South, West, and North of East Asia. North Asia includes Russia, and Central Asia includes the various stands, which is West Asia includes the Middle Eastern countries, and South and Southeast Asia includes India, Philippines, Thailand, and others. If you look to the US 2020 census for a definition of Asian, it closely follows the geographic view. And anyone who is of Indian subcontinent, including Pakistan, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Malaysia, these all are considered Asian under our census. The census, however, does not consider Hawaiian or Pacific Islander as Asian. They're in their own category. I wonder how many of you think of phylogenetics, which is the study of evolution and the diversification of species. Humans are all one species under this tree. And whether we are white, black, brown, or yellow, we are all subspecies to each other. In the middle of this tree is a subspecies called, I kid you not, the Greater Asian. It contains a lot of what the census mentioned as Asian, but the Greater Asian subspecies includes Pacific Islanders like the Polynesians and the Micronesians. Interestingly, the Iranians and North Indians are grouped with the Italians and the English under the Caucasian subspecies. While a little bit odd, it is clinically useful to think of ethnicities in these groupings, as various medical research on diseases like hepatocellular carcinoma and thyrotoxic periodic paralysis are seen more often in the Greater Asians. Also, drug research relies on knowing differences in drug metabolism, which can vary in Asian versus non-Asian populations. So with all of this, where does your definition of Asian American come from? History defines Asian American in a slightly different way. A group of graduate students at Berkeley were inspired by the wave of Black Power and coined Asian American in 1968 in likeness of the term African American. And it's worth knowing that not everyone identifies as Asian American, in part because there's a medley of definitions. So I think it's worth looking up what's floating around in our lexicon nowadays. In addition to Asian American, we also have terms like AAPI, AAPI, short for Asian American Pacific Islander. And today I'll use AAPI and Asian American interchangeably. Variants APISA with an S to emphasize the South Asian presence, and another variant, APITA, which brings out the D for Desi, acknowledging those on the Indian subcontinent. Hearing a lot was American born, and then insert your ethnicity. For me, it was American born Chinese, or ABC. Another moniker that arrived from Hawaii is Hapa, which is a term of endearment for multiracial Asians. It's also worth knowing the terms that are in the various stages of being outdated. There's Jap, short for Japanese, that we limit to old time, and Oriental, which we should just leave for specialty rugs. And there's a subsection of terms that are somewhat ambiguous and even controversial. There's yellow, which after falling out of favor for many years is now reappearing as a reclaimed label in certain Asian circles. I also put a question mark after brown because this is a term that some South and Southeast Asians use, but Latinx and those of Central Asian origin have appropriated this as well. Person of color, or POC, is also a term that, while politically correct, stands to be made less ambiguous by using one of the other more specific and inclusive Asian terms. And a variant of that, which is BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous, Person of Color, while is in vogue and appropriate when we want to emphasize the colonization and incredible dehumanization of Black and Indigenous folks in our country, this is not a term that I would use to specifically describe someone as Asian. There are these terms and more to consider, and the best thing to do when you want to outwardly identify a person as a type of Asian is to ask. And know that identity changes with time, external events, and that Asian American today may not be a term that fits the individual the next time you speak to them. While the name Asian American was coined in 1968, I'm not going to stop just at the name. I believe in knowing the history, which will tell us the name's value. Be forewarned that I'm going to go through what is a gross simplification of a very colorful and complex history of Asian Americans. So let's use it as a jumping off point for your further research and readings. For now, I'd like for you to visualize the history of 3 big waves of Asians coming to America, and each wave is signified in the timeline by the thick notch. We begin with the 19th century. In the 19th century, the first wave of Asian immigrants to the US included Indians, most of whom were Sikh and Punjab. There were also Japanese immigrants that arrived in the 1840s, and then Chinese immigrants, the latter who consisted of laborers and contributed to the transcontinental railroads in 1869. The second half of the 1800s was marked by very important legislation, the first of its kind. What was thought to be protective was actually the first legal encapsulation of xenophobic sentiment towards the Chinese. This period was called the Yellow Peril and marked by the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred Chinese immigrants from entering the US for the next 10 years, and then they renewed it for another decade after. During this time, other Asian groups continued to immigrate in. Then a global event triggered a second wave of Asian immigration to America. And hint, it was not a global pandemic. It was World War II. From the 40s to the 80s, immigration caps were raised for those with special skills, which contributed to the model minority myth, and I'll go into that later. The picture on the left is of Filipino nurses who came to California following the nursing shortages of the 60s. And on the right is a photo of the 442nd Infantry Regiment that was composed mostly of Nisei, which is Japanese-born American men who were fighting for America during World War II while their families were in U.S. internment camps. About 20 years after World War II, the term Asian American was coined. And it was shortly after this period that we consider the third wave of Asian immigration to the U.S. to have begun. From the 80s to today, From the 80s to today, the third wave includes the parachute generation. Here is a cover photo on this timeline of a New York Times article that showed how the number of Chinese immigrant high schoolers in the U.S. skyrocketed from 600 to nearly 40,000 within 10 years. Again, this is a brief summary of the movement of Asians to and in America, which by and large reflects political and economical forces. Now, let's move into the present landscape of Asians in America. So how many Asians are there in America? Based on the 2020 census, approximately 6 in every 100 US citizens are OPI. So out of the 382 million, about 23 million are OPI. And the vast majority of the OPI come from 6 subgroups. First, the Chinese, 23%, and then second to that, Indian, followed by Filipino, then Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese. Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders make up an additional 1 million, which is shown in the pie graph on the right as 2% of the total OPI demographic. And in that small gray slice, I have also have listed the other Asian ethnicities. New York has a slightly higher OPI presence compared to the country overall, with 9 in every 100 New York residents being OPI. A breakdown of the Asian subgroups in New York in 2010 indicated that similar to the national landscape, Chinese were the most. Start to differ a bit. Then the main subgroups after that included Koreans, Filipinos, the Bangladeshi, and Pakistani. And these numbers are expected to grow as the Pew report projected. In 40 years, Asians are expected to exceed the Hispanic representation in our country. So it's a matter of when, not if, we see more Asian Americans in our care settings. And I'm starting to see more of that in my own private practice, and perhaps you too, if not in your clinics. But what does that look like in numbers? Again, if 6 out of every 100 US citizens are OPI, and approximately 15% are reporting mental illness, that averages out to a little less than 1 in every 100 US citizens are OPI and reporting a mental illness. And we know that's underreporting because a little over 1 in 100 got care in 2019 in our mental health sector. So what's holding this demographic back? Well, a couple of things. On top of the fact that mental illness carries a universal stigma, it's particularly shameful and stigmatizing for Asian immigrants to admit or seek mental health services. To do either would really be to admit weakness and perhaps indirectly bring on shame to your family. And as an immigrant or a less privileged person in America, you have more to lose. The concept of losing face is very alive for Asians, especially first generation. And I'll just share, even this past week when I was receiving consultation from my Asian American consultant, it was very interesting that she used the term losing face with me. And I think it had a special resonance for the both of us. We understand what that means. Additionally, there aren't enough mental health services in New York that are linguistically and culturally diverse enough to address the various ethnicities that comprise OPI. How many therapists do you know are bilingual in an OPI-affiliated language? I, for one, am currently not fluent enough in Mandarin to conduct a prolonged, meaningful session. If psychiatry is not foreign enough, it can also be very intimidating for OPI to seek one-on-one services, which can be a huge leap for those who have not yet embraced this Western concept of mental health. So group and community-based services, which may be more palatable, are lacking at this time. Speaking of lack, the available research at best splits OPI into Asians and Native Hawaiian/Pacific Islanders. However, traditions, languages, the body, spiritual community, diet amongst ethnic groups are so diverse that this dichotomous approach is grossly insufficient. And making the research process itself difficult is just that there aren't quite enough OPI represented in the US, much less mental health, to be represented through convenient sampling. For example, when I was doing a talk for one of the VAs, I found in the report for minority veterans with mental illness a disclaimer written in the report that basically said, there are not enough Asians in our VA exact numbers in this report. It took a lot more digging for me to figure that out, going through 3 different additional agencies. I found it, but I think that's the general spirit, that it's hard to find the exact picture if we don't have the exact numbers or even big enough numbers. I think something else that also very much brings this to light is that there is a book I highly recommend called Spirit Catches You When You Fall Down. And this book opened my eyes many years ago and still offers, I think, as a salient example of what can be lost when we aren't aware of the nuances within the OPI community. But in this book, they talk about a traditional subset of the Hmong people who believe that seizures are a divine possession of the body. But this is not a widely held view in other OPI groups. How much or how little we have expanded our Western knowledge with cultural details like this makes the doctor-patient relationship even more challenging. We must be aware that the Western culture, a Eurocentric lineage, has a history of creating power imbalances. And this can be enacted when the people providing psychiatric care are unaware that offering equal services like one-on-one does not mean it's necessarily equitable or accessible to the person in front of you. There are also myths that impact our society's perception on Asian Americans, and therefore probably those in mental health providing services. Myth number 1 is that Asians are all the same. Well, the definitions of Asian earlier in this talk prove otherwise. The monolith myth supports a simplification of understanding OPI. Imagine going to a paint store and saying, I want some yellow paint. And the person helping you says, which one? You want the yellow highlighter? What about the sun-kissed yellow or the banana ripe yellow? Oh, do you mean goldenrod? In my private practice, I run groups for anyone who identifies as an Asian therapist, psychiatrist, or trainee. And I accept that Asian American is not a monolith, which means I've also taken another step to disavow a shortcut to understanding them. Asian American is but one layer of identity, and we need to borrow from other areas to inform our understanding. And just like paint, which comes in textures and sheens or lack thereof, there are other aspects to a person besides their ethnic label. There are other components of an individual to consider. Imagine observing one of my Asian identified therapist psychiatrist groups. What would you know of their values, their cultural negotiation, the East versus West? What about the part of America that they hail from, as I do invite members from coast to coast? If they were so transparent, like these circles here on the slide, where the color blue represents the Western informed part of the individual, and the pink, the Eastern informed roots, it would be much easier. Underneath, individuals have different experiences of America, socioeconomics, education, and family imported values. This is a taste of intersectionality, the composite identities of an individual. Another pitfall of assuming a monolith identity is related to the model minority myth. The model minority myth assumes that Asian Americans are a superior example of all minorities because they are industrious, obedient, resourceful, and therefore excellent U.S. citizens. But that should be a cause for some eyebrow raising. How did Asian Americans for whom Immigration Exclusion Acts were go from reviled to pedestaled? Historians like Ellen Wu have come up with some of the ingredients of this particular shift. It was a double PR agenda of American politics, looking to make American democracy more appealing after World War II, as the communist propagandas from Russia, Cuba, and parts of Asia arose and contributed to this era of the Cold War. And lifting the immigration bans and caps helped with US diplomacy and perhaps weakened any argument that social promotion and success was harder for non-whites. In addition to these political motivations, there was also the media. American newspapers, including the Times, began to explicitly compare Asians to Blacks, alleging that if Asians can be law-abiding, productive, and wealth-accumulating citizens, why can't Blacks? One theory is that Asians largely did better because they were treated better by people in power. Frank Chin, who is a writer, said in 1974, Asians were treated better because they were not Black. There is so much in Chin's statement. And when I read it and I hear, and I think it suggests that Asians are valued more for their utility rather than what they were and are as a diverse people. And I want to be clear that while one side did set up a dehumanizing and problematic system, Asian Americans did play a part in it. Asians do want to be seen as good Americans, as many minorities do, for interests of securing safety, housing, economic growth, especially if you come from, or if you come as a refugee from areas of oppression. It can be hard then to refuse the calculated opportunities that are presented. The historical inequities of immigration exclusion, interracial marriage banning, and internment have transformed into more subtle inequities of the present day. The model minority myth ignores the diversity and complexity of Asians. If we're all good, then we can be all given one approach. But in fact, Asians come to the US for different reasons and levels of finances, trauma, and therefore privilege. The poorest and the richest in America are Asian. But different ethnic groups, according to this Pew study, but come from different ethnic groups. And the model minority myth encourages us to only look and address those at the top of the rung. Also, the model minority myth is outdated. After 9/11, it's very apparent that we can edit this myth to exclude South and Central Asians. Another very big problem with the myth is that it pits minorities against each other. It's a slippery slope when we start to compare racial wounds, and it distracts from the greater problem that many wounds are here because of a system that doesn't address inequity. The wounds of Asians from being barred from entering the US, from gaining citizenship, imprisoned at internment camps while their sons fight for the US, are not the same as the wounds sustained by African Americans who suffered abductions from their motherlands, erasure of names, medical experimentation, and the majority of police brutality. And a system that has not addressed the psyche of racism, fear, and hate is a system that will have shortcomings in helping us move forward. These various myths feed into racial scapegoating. To understand racial scapegoating, let's define racism. It's a belief that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Key word, superiority. And scapegoating is a biblical reference to sacrificing an animal to protect the village from a wrathful God. And in the psychiatric sense, scapegoating is when one person or subgroup attributes or projects their own negative feelings or faults towards another person or subgroup. Racial scapegoating manifests in many ways, from the Atlanta massacre of 6 Asian women unsolicited beatings of elderly Asians, epithets, go back to your country, people making unnecessary room on the sidewalk for your unwanted presence, and the perpetuation of insidious myths. In this slide, in this graphic, I've included the New York State Commission art series for Asian social justice. The artist is Amanda Ping Bodhibakia, and her artwork is displayed all around New York City, particularly at sites where violence towards Asians have occurred. So next time you're in the subway, along the turnstile, waiting for the bus stop, on the sidewalk, take a look around. Her beautiful artwork is there. As we near the end of my presentation, I'd like to close with a request for reflection. What in this presentation has struck you? What has moved you, if at all, even by a degree? If the answer is nothing, then here's my last shot. I'm going to take us back for a moment to the pandemic. The uncertainty of this past year for our physical health, our politics, and even telepsychiatry access should help us appreciate the other areas in which we can be more prepared. For one, Asians have one of the highest growth rates of any major racial and ethnic group in most years since 2000, and this will likely remain true for the future. So as clinicians and humans, you may want to consider the areas of your life where you encounter Asians. To your patients, you can ask them, where are you born or raised? And also the question of how do you identify? And this could be through sexuality, religiosity, pronouns. There's another question perhaps you may want to consider asking Asians, because there is a collective trauma that is happening right now. And the very asking of the question, are you more anxious nowadays with what's been going on? Are you avoiding certain areas because of what we've been hearing and seeing? That can be healing. Nancy McWilliams wrote in 2020, Psychotherapy in the Pandemic. And she said that under these pandemic circumstances, therapy feels different. Her work became more conversational, more intimate, and more revealing of the interdependencies between her and her patients. While I personally do not tell my patients my experience of anti-Asian sentiment, I am considering and more accepting that doing so may be on the spectrum of appropriate, even elemental, for some psychiatrists and what they see in their clinic room. Then so is anti-Asian hate. And we need to be creative in how we address these things, even if we come of psychotherapy. I would also take an inventory of what your walls, your background are saying, especially if you have paintings, photos, or spines of books that give off a predominant ethnic or hemispherical vibe. Although we don't have oodles of free time, we might want to consider reading. Remember, it was once a pleasure, and we could bring it back. And you could read on the lives of Asian Americans, their memoirs, their histories, either in books, movies, or podcasts. I've put out some photos here of books I've read recently. I'm finishing up Alex Tuzon's Big Little Man. He is a Filipino-American writer and just an absolute wordsmith. Many of us were drawn into this field because we were curious about others and their stories. And we refine our understanding of other people by understanding ourselves. So in the service of being more attuned, get in touch with your racist tendencies. The unfortunate part of being human is that we have a less pretty side that is prone to jealousy, anger, and fear. And we're not exempt from our feelings or the responsibility of having them and the formation of biases. In my own practice, I've discovered that Asian American community wants to be heard. The containers want to be contained. Even if you are unable to create spaces for the API population, at least be aware that such spaces need to exist for durations that outlast the media coverage of Asian-directed violence. I haven't heard about the Atlanta massacre in quite some time, but my groups don't need violence to recall their vulnerability and everything else that is brought to the table as intersectionality. And this next bullet here is pretty self-explanatory. You can't get much done in our world without money. And it doesn't take a lot, you don't need to give a lot, but all of us collectively can do something as simple as sign up for Amazon Smile and donate to our favorite charity. Well, Amazon will donate for you the next time you purchase laundry detergent or tissues. I donate to Asian Americans Advancing Justice, a nonprofit legal aid and civil rights organization that provides legal services and education for API, amongst other things. And finally, although we all have taken this self-defense courses in our clinics, hospitals, residencies, if you're looking for something a bit more applicable to your day-to-day, consider a bystander intervention training. I took the one by Holla Back, and it was great. And I felt that it gave me options to react however I felt comfortable and how I saw fit. If I was on the subway, the park, or any other place where something unsavory could happen. So we've reached the end, and I like to acknowledge the New York County Psychiatric Society and its affiliate, and its New York, the national affiliate, and Dr. Bob Shung, who has been my steady co-facilitator of our groups and a part of my Asian American education. The Eastern Group Psychotherapy Society, which is a New York branch of the national organization, American Group Psychotherapy Association, are also two organizations I like to acknowledge. These two organizations have been the platforms for our outreach and where we have hosted our Asian therapist experiential workshops, where therapists of all identities, so not just Asian, are welcome. I'd also like to acknowledge my family, who gave me the platform for my experiences and the many layers of my being. And to all of those who are working, talking, and metabolizing on these topics, thank you for being interested and active in your own way. So I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to foster a discussion here. Why don't I go ahead and stop my screen share? Okay.
People can feel free to raise their hand or, just unmute yourself and ask a question or send it over the chat.
So I see Leslie has left a comment. Leslie, your comment, I think, is on point. So Leslie said that flip, as in a flip chart, is a derogatory slang for Filipino. And in the Red Cross, we have to call it newsprint. So I think, Leslie, it's just a really good point that there are so many good derogatory terms, and probably that I recall when I was like, I had to Wikipedia some of this because I just wasn't sure of all the derogatory terms out there. And some of them are just, they seem quite benign. So I encourage everyone just to Google and get informed in that way. It's painful how people can appropriate even benign things to harm someone.
Hi, thank you for that amazing talk. It was very, very informative. One question I had was about your experience in running groups for members of the Asian community. I was wondering, what are some of the themes that tended to come up within that group, especially, I guess, in the context of COVID?
Yeah, so I'm going to protect, the identity of the group members, so I won't say anything that's too identifiable. But I can say, I think because COVID and the concomitant rise of the anti-Asian hate sentiments and just sort of the outward manifestations of that, people were feeling in particular, very vulnerable and unsafe. So one thing that I noticed was that when people first gathered in the beginning, there was a bit of storytelling, a bit of sharing, like coming to the table and, you know, showing, here's my wound, here's my, you know, sort of history that I've carried with me in my particular life. And people were just kind of, you know, sharing it in that way. And I think that in particular was a way of forming the group, identifying each other, saying we belong in this particular way, setting the stage for some semblance of safety. I'm not sure if that was satisfactory.
It was. And then another follow-up question I have is one question, I think from, did I see a raised hand? Yes. Stephen?
Stephen or Sarah Berkson?
Unmute. Hello. Hi,
Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello?
I can hear who's talking.
Okay. My question is, when you talking about going into questions you would ask people, there was one that to me didn't come up about background to them. And it comes from my attitude that, and a couple of things. One, I'm from a Jewish background, and I did some history where my ancestors came from. They were immigrants here. They came out of an oppressed background. They had discrimination against them, and so has every group that's an other in this country. And in many ways, the problems are the same for each group as they go through it differently. And groups that went through it before put it on other groups later. But one of the things I ask, because I think it's important, and I think about trauma a lot, is I always ask people where they came from, who here, when they came from whatever Asian background they came from, what were the reasons they moved here? Because there's a lot of trauma or difficulties that are behind what goes on that stay in the families and get transmitted and carry on and make them even more susceptible. I wonder if you consider looking at the family history and that migration in the immigration process as an important thing to ask everybody.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on the money. And, you know, when we're talking about trauma, there's certainly the present day collective trauma, but also the background and the history that people carry in with them that is kind of what makes them unique. And so certainly when I meet a patient for the first time, I go back to my little pedigree drawings and I, you know, see who's related to who and see how far back I can go. Because I do think, you know, this concept that we're all familiar with, the intergenerational passing down of trauma, is well and alive. So yeah, I think that's a great point, Stephen. Thank you for bringing that up.
Okay.
Let's see. I see that Sarah Berkson has raised her hand, and also Margaret. So if you don't mind, we'll go with Sarah first.
Hi, thank you for this talk. I have a couple questions. One is I'm also interested in learning more about your groups and like kind of what's the structure and process. And I'm curious about what are some common dilemmas that come up for clinicians and the different ways that people are navigating those.
And would that be the common dilemmas of those in the group, or more of an open question for people here?
Oh, I guess I was thinking about your group members.
Yeah. So I'll start with your first question. So the structure. So I have a couple of groups. One is a monthly support drop-in group. So the structure of the drop-in group is just, you know, once a month you come in, and it's 75 minutes. anyone, any time zone is allowed to come as long as you identify as an Asian therapist or trainee. It's similar with the process group, except that the process group is a weekly group. And so it carries with it a different level of intimacy and probably depth that is just inherent to the longitudinal nature of that kind of work. And your question about the common dilemmas of those in the group, I think is kind of like what Dr. Smalls-Monte was asking in the beginning, like what are some themes that are going on? You know, I think people do kind of marvel, you know, the first time they go into a new space that's rather unique for them, and there aren't many spaces that are just Asian identified. I mean, I'm sure that's changing now, and I hope that in a year, what I'm saying is just going to be super outdated. But I would say that's probably one of the dilemmas, is just getting over the fact that, yes, we're all like Asian, but also what next? And this is where the idea of intersectionality and your identity come to be very much in play, because while I may be Asian, and we have all suffered a collective trauma, what's my sexuality? What's your sexuality? Your pronouns, your gender, your background. Are you from Texas? Or are you from like the Brooklyn, New York? Other pieces of intersectionality. What trauma did you have as a kid? Did you have trauma? Was it big T, little t? All of these things come into play. So I think the common dilemmas, that's a bit hard for me to actually assess at this time, but I would say that we all come from a common palette of human emotions. And from there, we may, you know, pick and choose our ratios, or maybe we didn't have that much of a choice, but we pick and, to some extent, we pick and choose and we manifest our sort of feelings that color us in this more of an intersectional and individual way.
Thank you. And then another kind of thing is I appreciated how I think your talk encompassed the acknowledgement of race, both in terms of phylogenetics and in terms of a social construct. I'm like familiar with the idea of Asian BMI, but I think when I actually looked at the data, it was all based on like people who are Chinese. And I don't know if we actually have data on the other Asian ethnic groups. Likewise, like as a child psychiatrist, I'm interested in development, and I see like in often there's data on like puberty in African Americans versus whites, but it's like, well, what about everybody else? So I'm interested if you've found, like, what resources, if any, you've found to help us learn about these kinds of questions that can inform our work.
I'd like to ask you the same question. I'm in the same boat. I don't really have answers or a lot of resources there. And I think that's just such a limit of the research, which is OPI are just typically split up into Asian or Pacific Islander, perhaps not even more so. And sometimes, like you said, what the research is presented might be based on one particular article from many years ago off of one particular subgroup. And while Chinese people do represent, both in New York and on a national landscape, anywhere from 25 to 50% national New York respectively, it's not representative of the other 75 or 50%. And speaking of, I'm just even thinking about Stephen's comment earlier, there is a way in which our diets in our home country have also affected us and also been passed down to us in certain generations. Our stature, our build, our bone densities. I'm sure that has something to come into play. Even thinking of not of BMI, but, like food allergies and stuff, there's definitely a geographic, even ethnic sort of distribution. If you think of peanut allergies, lactose intolerance, all that sort of thing. I think it's an area that just needs more representation and question asking like you're putting out there right now. So thank you, Sarah. I think that's a good place to start.
Thanks.
Okay, so Margaret, I see that you wrote a question in the chat. Margaret's question was, can you say more about what is contributing to the growth of the Asian American population? Is it immigration for particular countries? Yes. So the rise in the Asian American representation in the U.S. is largely through immigration from other countries. I don't know exactly what those countries are. A Google of the Pew Report, they're just phenomenal in their sharing of these statistics. But I would probably guess that there's a huge influx from China. There's probably a huge influx from India as well. So that's where I'm going to guess is. Another thing I might also want to just say in that is that sometimes people come and then they leave. So I'm sure the Pew Report, very reputable, takes that into account, but perhaps there's also some a range of statistics that we may also want to consider. Actually, someone just privately messaged me. I think this person's giving me some impressive stats. So the 3 largest sources of Asian immigration to the U.S. In 2019 were India by 19%, China 17%, and the Philippines 15%.
Right.
Okay, and I don't see any more hand raising, so I'm just going to go through the chat some more. Thank you, Yushi, for your compliment. So you're bringing up, I'm just going to read out loud. You mentioned the language difficulty in your presentation. Example, not able to provide therapy in a culture-specific language fluently. I was wondering if you have any strategies to maintain improved therapeutic alliance when there is a language challenge. Thank you. Okay, well, I do work in a clinic in which, at the World Trade Center clinic, where there is a large representation of Latinx individuals, and I have many patients who only speak Spanish. And one thing that I found particularly helpful is that we can't have a physical interpreter in here in the room, but we have a phone interpreter. And even there is a pool to talk to the phone, but the person's sitting right there in front of you, or the person's right there in front of your screen. So what I try to do is when I'm talking to the patient or I'm listening to the patient, even if I'm meeting the interpreter, I still try to make eye contact. I might even emphasize some of my, nonverbal cues like hand gestures, nodding my forehead, the expressions of my face, just to help deliver that message. Because I hear sometimes when the interpreter speaks, because I understand some Spanish, doesn't quite have my inflection, doesn't quite have that emotion that I'm trying to convey. So I really try to be a bit more animated, so that might stay with the individual as they're listening to the interpreter filter out what I'm saying. Okay, and then Ran Lee has a comment and question. I recently started leading a process group for OPI trainees. Do you have any tips and pearls based on your experience? Okay, tips. One thing that I'm becoming very appreciative of is just, the whole transference, countertransference. When you're treating someone, or not necessarily, but in the room with someone, facilitating something, it can trigger a lot of things in you, especially if they're unprocessed, especially if they're fresh, as is this collective trauma, the anti-Asian hate. And that can make the work a bit tricky, challenging, but also very vibrant and very rewarding. So I would say that if you are doing such intensive work that you're trying to hold space for people, but of course you're also going to be affected by it, is to get some good consultation. The containers need to be contained. And so I really want to bring that home. And as long as you're continuing in this self-discovery, helping others discover themselves, putting feelings and thoughts into words, you may need your own peer supervision, or more top-down consultation. You can find a consultant who or peer group that is also Asian or of an identity you identify with to kind of work on in those moments, the parallel process. So that would be kind of my tip when it comes to that. And I am taking my own medicine. So we have just 2 minutes left. I'm sure there are things that are going to be left unsaid, but I hope no one's walking out of here with any regrets. So if you do, you only got 2 minutes.
I think there was one more question in the chat.
Oh, Jeffrey. Okay, great. Jeffrey Liu. I wonder, given your experience as an Asian American, what do you think about matching therapist-patient by race ethnicity? Like an Asian American patient being seen by an Asian American therapist. I guess from the patient's perspective, sometimes that can be the attraction, the pull. Oh, you know, if I work with this East Asian appearing person, then I'll be more likely to be understood. They'll know what it means to have a tiger mom or a tiger parent. They'll know what it means to like be, you know, forced or, you know, pressured to get straight A's. But I think that's a bit presumptive, because again, one Asian American is not like the next necessarily, though there are some things that are shared. And I think you don't have to be Asian to treat an Asian person, but you have to be open. You have to be really open to that experience and to acknowledge what you know and what you don't know, and perhaps even seek consultation or discussion to fill in those gaps, and to be open in asking your patients. Because I do treat patients who are not always Asian, and they have cultures and traditions, diets. I have one who's fasting for Ramadan, and I don't do that, but I'm open to hearing about it, and I express that. Okay, I think we're at our time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much again for the questions from the audience, for that presentation, Dr. Lee. Everyone for joining us. I think it was very informative. We learned a lot in terms of history and just how we engage with others of a different group. So thank you very, very much. We also want to thank PRMS, who is one of our platinum sponsors for this event. And I would also like to say, if you are interested in, joining, NYCPS or even the Minority Affairs Committee, which sponsored this event, please reach out to us as well. We hope that you were able to take something from this event, and that we plan to continue having more talks in this series, Dismantling Racism. So I hope that you'll find them to be of benefit to you. So again, thank you so much for joining, and have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.